January. Early morning. High above the Pacific, the air is thin and cold, even inside the cockpit. A single P-47 Thunderbolt cuts through the sky at altitude, its massive radial engine vibrating with a deep, steady growl. The aircraft is heavy, overbuilt. 8 machine guns sit silent in the wings, their barrels already cold. Frost clings to the canopy edges as the pilot adjusts his oxygen mask and scans the horizon. Below him, sunlight glints off the ocean like broken glass. Then, movement. 5 shapes rise from the haze beneath the Thunderbolt. Small, light, agile. Japanese fighters climbing hard, their noses angled skyward, confident in numbers and maneuverability. They expect a turning fight. They expect a slow, lumbering American interceptor. They do not expect speed. The Thunderbolt begins to descend, nose tipping forward, gravity pulling the aircraft into a controlled fall. Airspeed climbs rapidly. The engine roars louder. The sky narrows into a tunnel of blue. Inside the cockpit, there is no panic, only calculation, altitude, velocity, timing. What will happen next will unfold in minutes, but it will leave no confusion about why American pilots gave this aircraft a brutal nickname, and why 5 enemy fighters are about to learn exactly what it means. The world that produced this encounter had already been burning for years. By the time American P-47 Thunderbolts began appearing regularly over the Pacific, the air war had evolved into a contest not just of pilots, but of industries, doctrines, and time itself. Japan had entered the war with an experienced cadre of aviators, hardened by years of combat in China. Their early victories were built on lightweight fighters, extreme maneuverability, and pilots trained to fight instinctively at close range. In the opening months, that combination proved devastating. But wars do not stand still. By 1943, the strategic balance was shifting. American factories were operating at a scale Japan could not match. Aircraft production numbers surged. Training pipelines expanded. Pilots arrived with hundreds of flight hours before ever seeing combat. They were taught discipline over bravado, teamwork over individual heroics, and above all, they were trained to survive. The Pacific Theater imposed its own brutal demands. Vast distances separated bases. Weather was unpredictable. Navigation errors could be fatal. Aircraft needed range, reliability, and the ability to absorb damage far from friendly airfields. Early American fighters struggled in this environment, especially when matched against nimble Japanese aircraft designed for short-range dominance. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not originally meant for the Pacific at all. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it was massive by fighter standards. Weighing nearly twice as much as some Japanese fighters, it looked out of place in a theater dominated by light, agile aircraft. Early critics called it too big, too slow to climb, too heavy to dogfight. But those judgments missed the point of what the Thunderbolt was built to do. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful radial engines ever mounted on a single-engine fighter. It gave the P-47 exceptional speed in a dive and the ability to operate at altitudes where many opponents struggled. Thick armor plating protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire. Redundancy was built into critical systems. This was an aircraft designed to bring its pilot home. Japanese fighter doctrine followed a different logic. Aircraft like the A-6M0 emphasized lightness above all else. Armor was sacrificed for agility. Fuel tanks were vulnerable. Control surfaces were exquisitely responsive at low speeds. In the hands of an experienced pilot, these fighters could outturn almost anything in the sky. But their performance declined sharply at high speeds and high altitudes, where control stiffening and structural limits became serious constraints. As the war progressed, Japan faced a growing problem: pilot attrition. Early aces were irreplaceable. Training programs shortened under pressure. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours and less experience. Meanwhile, American pilots were learning quickly. Early losses forced doctrinal change. Pilots were explicitly warned not to engage Japanese fighters in turning contests. Instead, they were trained to fight in the vertical plane, using altitude and speed as weapons. This shift reshaped the air war. The P-47 fit perfectly into this evolving philosophy. It could climb high, wait patiently, then strike with overwhelming force. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns delivered a volume of fire unmatched by most contemporaries. A single firing pass could shred lightly built aircraft, and if attacked, the Thunderbolt could dive away at speeds that many Japanese fighters could not safely follow. By late 1943 and into 1944, Thunderbolts were increasingly used in the Pacific for escort, interception, and ground attack roles. They were not elegant, they were not subtle, but they were brutally effective when flown according to doctrine. Japanese pilots, encountering them more frequently, struggled to adapt. Old instincts urged them to turn, to climb, to fight close. Against a Thunderbolt flown by a disciplined pilot, those instincts became liabilities. Each encounter reinforced the same lesson. The sky was no longer governed by agility alone. The engagement unfolding beneath the descending P-47 was not an isolated moment. It was the product of years of adaptation, hard lessons, and industrial momentum. And as those 5 fighters climbed to meet the Thunderbolt, they were stepping into a version of the air war that no longer favored them. The distance between doctrine and reality was about to collapse. By the time encounters like this became common, American air power in the Pacific had settled into a disciplined rhythm shaped by necessity rather than theory. Long-range missions demanded patience. Pilots climbed for extended periods, sometimes for more than an hour, nursing engines and conserving fuel. At altitude, formations spread out, each aircraft maintaining visual contact while scanning vast stretches of sky. Combat rarely came suddenly. More often, it announced itself as distant glints of sunlight, faint specks moving against the horizon. American doctrine emphasized control. Pilots were trained to think in terms of energy. Altitude and speed treated as interchangeable currencies. Height meant potential. Speed meant options. Losing both meant death. Thunderbolt pilots were drilled relentlessly to avoid horizontal turning fights. If an enemy fighter tried to draw them in close, the correct response was not aggression, but separation. Dive away, regain altitude, reset the fight on favorable terms. This mindset stood in sharp contrast to the combat culture many Japanese pilots had inherited. Early war success had reinforced aggressive, close-range engagements. Victory was achieved by outmaneuvering the opponent in tight spirals and quick reversals. But as American aircraft grew faster and heavier, these tactics became increasingly dangerous. Chasing a diving Thunderbolt often meant exceeding safe airspeeds. Control stiffened, structures failed. Even if a Japanese fighter survived the dive, it often emerged slow, low, and exposed. Operational geography intensified these disparities. Fighting over island chains and open ocean left little margin for error. Damaged aircraft could not always reach friendly territory. A single hit to a cooling system or fuel line might doom a pilot minutes later. The Thunderbolt's ruggedness became an invisible advantage. It could take punishment and keep flying. Stories spread among pilots of P-47s returning with cylinders shot away, control surfaces damaged, entire sections of wing perforated, yet still landing safely. These stories were not propaganda. They were recorded in maintenance logs and after-action reports. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, paid a steep price for light construction. Hits that might wound a Thunderbolt could be catastrophic. Fuel fires were common. Control cables snapped. Structural failures occurred under stress that American aircraft absorbed routinely. As American forces pushed westward across the Pacific, air superiority became less contested and more enforced. The role of fighters expanded. Thunderbolts escorted bombers, intercepted enemy reconnaissance, and increasingly attacked ground targets. Each mission honed pilot confidence and familiarity with the aircraft's strengths. Pilots learned to trust the machine. They learned exactly how fast they could dive without losing control, how long they could hold a firing pass, how much punishment the aircraft could take. Confidence replaced hesitation, and in aerial combat, confidence often determined who seized the initiative. Japanese pilots noticed the change. Encounters grew shorter, engagements ended faster. Where once fights devolved into swirling dogfights, they now unfolded in vertical slashes, brief, violent, and decisive. A Thunderbolt would appear from above, fire, and vanish. Sometimes it returned, sometimes it did not need to. By this stage of the war, numbers also mattered. American formations were larger, replacements were steady. Losses, while still tragic, could be absorbed. Japan's air units thinned. Experienced leaders were lost. New pilots learned under fire, often without the luxury of gradual adaptation. The encounter about to unfold between a single Thunderbolt and 5 Japanese fighters reflected this imbalance. It was not about bravery or skill alone. It was about systems, training pipelines, manufacturing output, doctrinal evolution, converging at a single point in the sky. The Thunderbolt descending now carried not just guns and armor, but the accumulated weight of a war that had already shifted in its favor, and in the next moments, that weight would be released with terrifying clarity. Inside the Thunderbolt's cockpit, the human element mattered as much as horsepower or armor. The pilot was alone with the noise and vibration, oxygen flowing steadily as the aircraft accelerated. Training took over, hands moved without conscious thought. Throttle adjusted, trim set. Eyes locked on the geometry of the intercept. There was no rush, no surge of adrenaline yet, only focus. American pilots were taught to avoid emotional decision-making. Panic wasted energy. Discipline preserved it. For many Thunderbolt pilots, the aircraft inspired a particular kind of confidence. It was not sleek. It did not promise elegance, but it offered security. Pilots knew they could make mistakes and still survive. That knowledge changed how they fought. They committed fully to firing passes, holding their aim steady for fractions of a second longer, trusting that the aircraft could absorb return fire. Below, the enemy pilots saw something very different. From their perspective, the Thunderbolt was enormous, its broad wings and thick fuselage unmistakable. It looked slow, heavy, like something that could be pulled into a turning fight and finished cleanly. Numbers favored them. 5 against 1 suggested opportunity. Aggression came naturally, but this misreading of the aircraft proved fatal again and again. The Thunderbolt was never meant to turn tightly. It was meant to strike hard and leave. Its mass became an advantage once gravity joined the fight. In a dive, weight translated directly into speed. Control surfaces remained effective at velocities that stressed lighter frames. Where Japanese pilots felt their controls stiffen, Thunderbolt pilots still had authority. Technology amplified this disparity. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted across the wings, synchronized only by the pilot's aim. The volume of fire was staggering. When triggered, nearly 100 rounds per second tore forward in a dense cone. Against lightly armored aircraft, even brief exposure could be catastrophic. Fuel tanks ruptured, engines disintegrated, control surfaces vanished. Japanese aircraft design philosophy had assumed that being hit was something to avoid entirely. Protection was minimal because protection added weight, but once hit, survival odds dropped sharply. Pilots knew this. It shaped how they flew. They tried to avoid head-on passes. They favored turning engagements where fleeting snapshots decided the fight. The Thunderbolt reversed that logic. Its armor allowed pilots to accept head-on approaches. Its firepower made those passes lethal. What Japanese pilots saw as mutual risk, American pilots saw as calculated advantage. Tactically, this translated into predictability. Japanese fighters often climbed aggressively to meet high-altitude threats. They expected opponents to commit downward, lose energy, and be forced into turns. But Thunderbolt pilots had learned restraint. They waited. They aligned. They struck only when geometry favored them. The 5 fighters climbing now were following doctrine shaped by earlier wars. The Thunderbolt descending toward them represented a doctrine shaped by survival in an industrial conflict. These two approaches could coexist briefly in the same sky, but not for long. Leadership decisions made years earlier now manifested in seconds of violence. Training manuals written far from the front determined which pilot would hesitate and which would act. As altitude closed and speeds converged, there was no room left for theory. Only execution remained. The tactical reality of the coming engagement was already decided by geometry. The Thunderbolt held altitude and speed. The Japanese fighters held neither. Their climb cost energy with every second. Engines straining as thinner air robbed them of power. Each meter gained upward narrowed their options. They were committing to a single solution: intercept and turn. American pilots were trained to see this moment as an opening. Boom and zoom tactics were not improvisation. They were procedure. Dive, fire, extend. do not linger, do not turn, do not chase wreckage. Every action had a purpose measured in seconds and altitude lost or gained. The goal was not to outfly the enemy, but to deny him choices. As the Thunderbolt descended, its pilot was already planning the exit. Escape routes were chosen before the first shot. Speed would be converted back into altitude. If pursued, the pursuer would fall behind. If not, the Thunderbolt could climb again and repeat the process. This methodical violence contrasted sharply with the chaos often attributed to air combat. From the Japanese perspective, the fight demanded immediacy. Delay meant surrendering initiative, yet haste increased risk. Once the Thunderbolt committed to its dive, there was only a narrow window to respond. Turn too early, and the aircraft bled speed. Turn too late, and it was caught in a firing solution. Leadership philosophy echoed through these decisions. American air commanders emphasized pilot preservation. An aircraft lost could be replaced. A trained pilot could not be wasted. Japanese leadership, under increasing pressure, often emphasized mission completion at any cost. Withdrawal was discouraged. Survival became secondary to engagement. These pressures shaped behavior in the cockpit. Japanese pilots pressed attacks even when conditions turned unfavorable. They closed distance aggressively. They accepted head-on passes that exposed fragile aircraft to overwhelming fire. Courage was unquestionable, but courage did not change physics. Morally, this imbalance weighed heavily on those who recognized it. Thunderbolt pilots understood that many of their opponents were younger, less experienced, and flying machines that offered little forgiveness. Some described a sense of inevitability in late war encounters. Others focused solely on survival, compartmentalizing the consequences. The sky allowed little room for reflection. The aircraft itself became a moral buffer. Its nickname, Meat Chopper, was not born of cruelty, but of effect. It described what happened when mass, speed, and firepower met light construction at close range. It was brutal, efficient, unapologetic. As the Thunderbolt closed the final distance, doctrine, leadership, and technology converged into a single moment. The angles collapsed into a straight line of fire. There would be no drawn-out duel, no circling dance. Only a few seconds where decisions made years earlier would be tested without mercy. And then the fight would begin. The Thunderbolt rolled slightly left, nose dipping just enough to align the dive. Airspeed climbed fast, 200 knots, 300. The sound inside the cockpit deepened as the propeller bit harder into the air. Control inputs remained steady. There was no violence in the motion, only gravity doing its work. The Japanese fighters grew rapidly in the windscreen, their silhouettes resolving into wings and canopies. They were still climbing. That was the mistake. At this speed and angle, the Thunderbolt was untouchable. The pilot waited until the geometry locked in, range collapsing, closure rate measured in heartbeats. He did not fire early. Early shots wasted ammunition and telegraphed intent. He waited until the lead fighter filled the reflector sight. Then he pressed the trigger. The Thunderbolt shuddered as 8 machine guns erupted at once. Tracers stitched forward in a tight stream, converging just ahead of the nose. The firing pass lasted barely 2 seconds. That was enough. The first Japanese fighter disintegrated almost instantly. The engine cowling burst apart, fragments tearing backward into the fuselage. Fuel ignited. The aircraft rolled sharply and fell away trailing flame. No recovery possible at that altitude. The Thunderbolt did not follow. It punched through the formation at nearly 400 miles per hour, already extending away as the pilot released the trigger. The remaining fighters scattered instinctively, breaking formation, each reacting alone. That fragmentation sealed their fate. The Thunderbolt climbed shallowly now, converting speed back into altitude. One Japanese fighter tried to follow, pushing its nose down to gain speed. The airframe began to vibrate. Controls stiffened. The pilot could not close the distance. Within seconds, the Thunderbolt was already pulling away. Another Japanese aircraft attempted a tight turn, hoping to reverse direction and catch the American as it climbed. The maneuver bled speed rapidly. The fighter hung momentarily in the air, wings shuddering at the edge of a stall. The Thunderbolt rolled back down. Again, gravity did the work. The pilot corrected slightly, lined up the sight, and fired a short burst. The rounds tore through the Japanese fighter's wing root. Structural failure followed immediately. The wing folded. The aircraft snapped into a spiral, breaking apart as it fell. 2 down. The remaining 3 were no longer attacking, they were reacting. One dove straight down, trying to escape. Another climbed desperately, hoping altitude might offer safety. The third hesitated, caught between instincts. The Thunderbolt chose the diver. At high speed, it followed just long enough to force the Japanese pilot lower, faster, beyond safe limits. The lighter aircraft began to shake violently. The pilot tried to pull up. The airframe could not take it. Control was lost. The fighter slammed into the sea below, leaving only a brief white scar on the water. The Thunderbolt broke off before reaching dangerous speed, leveling smoothly and climbing once more. Above, the 2 remaining fighters were now separated by distance and altitude. Mutual support was gone. One tried to flee outright, turning away and running low and fast. The other, perhaps driven by training or desperation, turned back toward the Thunderbolt. This time, the approach was head-on. The Thunderbolt did not flinch. The closing speed was enormous. Tracers flashed past the canopy, a few strikes ringing dully against armor. The Thunderbolt's pilot held steady until the last possible moment, then fired. The Japanese fighter burst apart mid-air, fragments scattering in a brief silent cloud. The Thunderbolt passed through the debris field untouched. Only one remained. That final fighter was already gone, fleeing toward the horizon, its pilot unwilling or unable to re-engage. The Thunderbolt did not chase. Fuel mattered. Discipline mattered. The mission mattered. In less than minutes, the sky had been emptied. The Thunderbolt climbed back to altitude, alone again, engine steady, guns silent. Smoke columns drifted far below, marking where the engagement had ended almost as quickly as it had begun. The turning point had passed. What remained was consequence. Silence returned slowly, broken only by the steady rhythm of the engine. Inside the cockpit, the pilot checked his instruments methodically. Oil pressure normal, temperature steady, ammunition counters low but sufficient. The Thunderbolt bore new scars, small holes punched through outer skin, a dent along one wing root where a round had struck and failed to penetrate. None of it mattered. The aircraft was still flying exactly as designed. Below, the ocean absorbed the evidence. There was no sense of triumph, no time for it. Combat reports would come later. For now, the pilot's responsibility was singular: return alive. He leveled off at altitude, scanning the sky once more, alert for anything else that might be climbing to meet him. Nothing came. The engagement had lasted only minutes, but its outcome was decisive in a way that left no ambiguity. 5 fighters had entered the fight, believing they held the advantage. 4 were gone. 1 had escaped without firing another shot. The Thunderbolt had not been forced to adapt mid-fight. It had imposed its terms from the first second to the last. This was the essence of the turning point. Earlier in the war, such an encounter might have unfolded very differently. A lighter American fighter might have been drawn down, bled of energy, and surrounded. But this was no longer that war. The Thunderbolt represented a mature phase of aerial combat, one where survival, firepower, and doctrine aligned perfectly. For Japanese air units, these encounters accumulated into something corrosive. Pilots spoke of American fighters that could not be shaken, aircraft that absorbed punishment and kept coming, attacks that arrived from above and ended before they could be answered. Morale suffered not from cowardice, but from repetition. Each loss reduced the pool of experience. Each replacement arrived with fewer hours and less confidence. American pilots felt the shift as well. Engagements became less chaotic. Outcomes became more predictable. The sky increasingly belonged to those who controlled altitude and timing. The Thunderbolt, once doubted, earned a reputation that spread quickly across squadrons. Pilots learned to trust it implicitly. Commanders learned to deploy it aggressively. Records would later confirm what had happened in moments like this one. Gun camera footage showed brief flashes, then debris. Mission logs recorded enemy aircraft destroyed in rapid succession. Maintenance crews counted bullet holes and shook their heads at what the aircraft had endured. Intelligence officers noted declining Japanese fighter effectiveness in contested zones. But none of that captured the full weight of what had changed. The turning point was not just tactical. It was psychological. It marked the moment when air combat ceased to be an even contest of individual skill and became an expression of overwhelming system advantage. Training, production, doctrine, and technology had fused into something that could not be countered by courage alone. As the Thunderbolts set course for home, the sun climbed higher, burning away the haze. The sky looked calm again, empty, deceptively peaceful. But that calm was not neutrality. It was control, and that control would shape everything that followed. The aftermath of encounters like this unfolded first on paper, long after the sky had gone quiet. Back at base, pilots filed their combat reports with careful precision: times, altitudes, headings, estimated enemy types and positions. Claims were cross-checked against gun camera footage and the accounts of other airmen in the area. Victories were not awarded lightly. Each confirmation mattered, not for pride, but for understanding what was happening in the air. Maintenance crews inspected the returning Thunderbolt closely. They counted impacts, patched holes, logged damage. The aircraft's survival told its own story. Hits that would have destroyed lighter fighters had been absorbed by armor and structural strength. Engines that might have seized kept running. These reports filtered upward, reinforcing confidence in the aircraft and validating the doctrine built around it. For American commanders, the implications were clear. Thunderbolts operating at altitude could dominate encounters with numerically superior enemy forces. They could break formations, destroy aircraft quickly, and disengage at will. This allowed air planners to commit fewer fighters with greater effect, freeing resources for other missions: escort, ground attack, interdiction. Japanese losses, by contrast, were harder to replace. Each aircraft destroyed represented not just material loss, but the erosion of experience. Veteran pilots were becoming scarce. New aviators arrived with truncated training, thrown into combat before mastering advanced tactics. Reports from surviving pilots spoke of American fighters that could not be forced into mistakes. Attempts to lure them into turning fights failed. Pursuits ended in disaster. Operational adjustments followed, but they lagged behind reality. Japanese units experimented with different intercept altitudes and formations. They attempted massed attacks, hoping numbers might overwhelm American discipline. But fuel shortages, limited radar coverage, and declining aircraft quality constrained these efforts. The window for adaptation was closing. The psychological toll was equally severe. Pilots began to approach combat with caution, bordering on fatalism. The sight of a high-altitude American fighter no longer inspired confidence, but dread. Morale eroded incrementally, with each encounter reinforcing the sense of imbalance. Air superiority was not declared. It was felt. For American pilots, success brought its own pressures. Confidence had to be managed carefully. Overconfidence led to mistakes. Squadrons emphasized adherence to doctrine, even after repeated victories. Briefings stressed discipline. Debriefings analyzed errors as closely as successes. Survival remained the priority. The Thunderbolt's reputation grew. Nicknames spread. Stories circulated of aircraft returning on one wing, engines damaged yet functional, pilots alive against all odds. These accounts were grounded in reality, supported by maintenance records and combat data. The aircraft became synonymous with resilience and lethal efficiency. As these engagements accumulated, their effects rippled outward. Air corridors became safer for bombers. Ground forces operated with increased support. Enemy reconnaissance flights dwindled. The skies over contested regions gradually emptied of opposition. The immediate aftermath of a single engagement faded quickly. Wreckage sank. Reports were filed. Aircraft were repaired. Pilots flew again. But the cumulative impact remained, shaping every subsequent mission. And the war was far from over. The broader consequences emerged over weeks and months, not minutes. As American air power tightened its grip on the Pacific skies, the balance of initiative shifted decisively. Japanese air units found themselves reacting rather than shaping engagements. Missions became defensive. Intercepts were launched out of necessity, not confidence. Each sortie carried greater risk and diminishing returns. Thunderbolts played an increasingly central role in this transformation. Their presence allowed American planners to think expansively. Fighters could range farther. Bombers could fly with greater protection. Ground targets once considered too dangerous were now struck repeatedly. Air superiority was no longer contested daily. It was enforced methodically. Japanese command reports reflected this erosion. Communications spoke of enemy aircraft with overwhelming firepower, of fighters that could not be outturned nor outdived. Loss ratios worsened. Fuel and aircraft shortages compounded the problem. The training cycle, already strained, could not keep pace with attrition. Experience drained away faster than it could be replaced. For ground forces, the change was unmistakable. American troops advanced with growing confidence under protective skies. Close air support became more reliable. Japanese positions were identified and attacked with increasing precision. The psychological effect of constant aerial presence weighed heavily on defenders, disrupting movement and supply. Air combat itself grew less frequent, but more decisive. Where engagements did occur, they often ended quickly. American pilots, now veterans of multiple sorties, recognized patterns instantly. Japanese pilots, increasingly isolated, faced opponents who dictated the terms of every encounter. The margin for error vanished. Strategically, this dominance shortened campaigns. Islands fell faster. Supply lines were severed more efficiently. Japanese attempts to contest the air diminished, as resources were diverted elsewhere or simply ran out. The sky ceased to be a battlefield and became a control domain. Yet within this dominance, individual moments like the Thunderbolt's encounter with 5 fighters remained instructive. They illustrated how modern warfare compressed outcomes. Preparation outweighed improvisation. Systems defeated skill when the imbalance grew too large. The human cost persisted, but the outcome became predictable. By the time the war neared its end, aircraft like the P-47 were no longer novelties or stopgaps. They were symbols of an approach to warfare defined by scale, durability, and relentless pressure. The meat chopper nickname endured not because of bravado, but because it captured a truth pilots could not ignore. When such an aircraft appeared overhead, the fight was already decided. All that remained was to survive, or not. In the end, what defined this moment in the sky was not aggression or even victory, but inevitability. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not win because it was faster in a turn or more graceful in combat. It won because it embodied a shift in how war was fought. Strength replaced delicacy. Survivability replaced elegance. Preparation replaced improvisation. The aircraft was a product of an industrial nation, learning, through loss, how to fight a global war without exhausting its people. Inside that cockpit was still a human being, breathing through an oxygen mask, making decisions under pressure, aware that a single mistake could still be fatal. Technology did not remove fear. It merely gave discipline more room to operate. The Thunderbolt did not guarantee survival. It increased the odds, and in war, odds are everything. For the pilots who faced it, the experience was often brief and terrifying. There was no prolonged duel, no chance to adapt mid-fight. The engagement arrived from above and ended before it could be understood. In those moments, bravery mattered less than physics. History often remembers wars through grand strategies and sweeping movements. But wars are decided in compressed instants like this, seconds where altitude, speed, and doctrine intersect. The sky over the Pacific absorbed countless such moments, most unrecorded, all irreversible. The P-47's legacy is not just measured in aircraft destroyed or missions flown. It lies in what it revealed about modern warfare, that survival favors systems that can endure stress, absorb damage, and keep functioning when conditions collapse. It showed that air combat had entered an age where preparation outweighed heroics, and where dominance was built long before the first shot was fired. When the Thunderbolt climbed away from that emptied sky, nothing dramatic followed. No ceremony, no celebration, just another mission completed, and that perhaps is the most telling detail of all.